Today marks the release of patch 11.1.7. Now, while the disc belt that is coming out right now might not be that big of a deal, as we have seen even after the buffs, it will be barely a 2% damage, maybe 3% damage increase in single target, and even then you will have to wait a few weeks until we get the max item level version of this belt. What also has come out in this reset is, of course, the much awaited and also much memed one button rotation. However, what also came along, the one button rotation helper for your characters, is also the assisted highlight function. So in the very simplest of ways, it means that once you go into the new addition of the gameplay enhancements, you have the option to enable the assisted highlight, as well as to just notice that there is now a single button assistant in your spellbook right over here. You can just drag it over to your bars and it will be available to whichever keybind you bind it to. Now, obviously, both of these two new functions have very similar features. They both do the same things in the sense that you get to press buttons that are part of your rotation, but that's it. If you look at the button rotation over here, it's just your typical damage buttons. It won't really include, of course, if you are, for example, in Mythic class, it won't include interrupts, knockups, stuns, crowd control, dispels, defensives, and of course also offensive cooldowns. So it is literally just your damage rotation. Now, the assisted highlight does a bit more, just slightly bit more. You can see here that if you are trying to play with the assisted highlight, which will very simply glow the next ability you are supposed to press, it will also go with some cooldowns sometimes, depending on your character, of course, and then it will follow, very often it will follow the same button over here of the one button rotation, right? It highlights more or less the same things. So with a slight difference that, for example, some of the buttons you are able to also get in form of cooldowns with the highlight assistant rather than the one button rotation, it is very similar. In the case of Druid, for example, that we are trying right now, you can see that both the one button rotation and the highlight assistant are pretty much ignoring our incarnation as a button. They can tell you to press every once in a while a slightly shorter cooldown, like for example Warrior of Elune on a 45-second cooldown. It is selected to be pressed by your highlight assistant, but not this cooldown. This can be different, for example, right over here with Monk, which you do get told by the highlight assistant to use things like Storm, Earth and Fire and things like your Conduit, but not in the case of Druid, for example, not for Incarnation. Now, of course, the one button rotation comes with the deficit, the handicap of being 25% slower. So the global cooldown, the speed in which you get to press buttons will be slower, which basically means, imagine you have 20 latency. You would have 270 latency if you were trying to play with the one button rotation, because the global cooldown would be going down slower if you try to click these buttons rather than the highlight assistant. Now, something then players have been talking about with this, the difference between the two, one button rotation and the highlight assistant. Obviously, the one button rotation is much more laid back, as very simply you can simply press the same button. You don't really have to worry about anything else, especially if, for example, you enter combat, you press your big cooldowns that are not pressed by the rotation. So you press your True Shot as a hunter, you press your Bestial Rat as a hunter, and then you just keep pressing the buttons of your rotation. So it is much simpler to follow. Meanwhile, the highlight assistant, you still have to press buttons on your own. You will get them highlighted by the game, but you have to press them yourselves. Now the differences that have made people talk a little bit when it comes to these two new additions is, well, number one, a side difference. For now, add-ons haven't updated properly, assuming they can even update. You don't get to see the highlighted icons on your bars. If you're using an add-on, you have to use, as you can see here, the default UI for the bars, for the buttons to highlight if you're using the highlight assistant. If you're using just naming a common one, bartender, it wouldn't be showing for now. But what has surprised players is that when they go and look at the expected damage loss for these two additions, like, okay, how much worse this would be if I played it? Well, the single button assistant has proven to give you quite a lot of a drop in damage, roughly between 20 to 30% of damage you're gonna be losing if you are playing with a single button assistant. For example, you can expect upwards of a 25% DPS loss if you're playing Feral, 25% DPS loss if you're playing Havoc, 15% DPS loss if you're playing Marksmanship, also upwards of 20% damage loss for the Warrior DPS specs. For Enhancement Shaman, even more than 20% for Elemental Shaman, so that was more expected. It still means that, for example, you can go and do delves, you can go and do world quests, or just questing in general, even normal dungeons or heroic dungeons or time walking dungeons with this one button rotation without too much issue. What has surprised players more was when looking at the supposed DPS difference between the assisted highlight, the highlight assistant mode, and unexpected rotation played by a human. Because in here you see DPS differences like, for example, a 4% DPS loss for Shadow Priest, a 7% DPS loss for Assassination, a 5% DPS loss for the Warriors, and even a 2% DPS loss for the very simple Beast Mastery Hunter. Now this is where there has been a little bit of a crime of conflating. The conflation that is happening here is that players have seen maybe some screenshots, some posts, some comments on how close these differences are, and have been conflating the two. They've been conflating the smaller DPS difference of the highlighted assistant mode with the one button rotation. So they assume, hold on a second, if this top simulation or top test done by a player playing optimally only gives me a 5% DPS loss if I'm playing, for example, Fury Warrior, then I probably would be doing even more damage if I use this single button assistant, because I'm not as good as a top level player, so I would be doing like 10% less damage anyways than a good player, so I might as well use this single button assistant, which is only 5% behind. And that's where the conflation is happening, because where these numbers are very close to each other is with the assisted highlight mode. Very simply, looking at your action bars and pressing what the assistant tells you to press. And these tests are done from the calm and quiet of a target dummy, with you looking at your action bars. Now imagine, instead of being right here, instead of trying on following the bars over here of this assisted highlight, which we press one after the other, we even press our own incarnation, and then we keep pressing whatever the assisted highlight tells you. Now imagine, instead of doing this, we are in the middle of Mythic Magzi, for example, or Mythic One-Armed Bandit. Well, I'm supposed to be dodging the flames, I'm supposed to be dodging the coins, I'm supposed to be multi-targeting the ads that spawn. I don't exactly have the time to be keeping my eyes at the bottom of my screen and looking at which of the icons are lighting up to follow this rotation. So even if the tests show that the assisted highlight, if followed to the letter, if just following all of the buttons that light up, can show, for example, a 5 or a 4 or a 7% DPS difference, this is still, of course, not what you would be able to do in a real life setting, in an actual fight in the raid, for example, or even in Mythic Plus, which doesn't really have even a proper set rotation, since in Mythic Plus you're also expected to use, interrupts, stuns, crowd controls, defensive, etc, etc, etc. But even just talking about the raid, there's a big misconception, because these tests were done on a target dummy, or in some cases even just simulated. While of course clicking on your buttons while looking at your bars is not something you probably would be able to pull off while actually fighting in an encounter. So while the rotation of the assisted highlight might bring you only to 2% worse than a normal player playing BM Hunter, it would be much harder to pull off when you're actually playing the game and not just testing this on a target dummy. And then there is, back to our dictionary issue, the conflating problem. The problem that players assumed or thought or read as these smaller DPS differences being the one given to you by the single button assistant. So people think, oh, I can go in the raid and simply keep pressing 1, keep smashing 1 and do only 2% worse than a normal player, or rather than a good player playing his optimal rotation. No, the single button assistant is much worse. It can be upwards of 30% worse for Fire Mage or 20% worse for the DKs, etc, etc. So, in short, the single button assistant is much worse and should only be, unless you want to grief your own teammates, your own guild mates and your own group mates, should only be played in a more laid back kind of content. So we're talking about, you know, LFR, normal raid, normal heroic dungeons, time walking dungeons, world quests, and that kind of content. Even delves, even delving would be probably fine with the single button assistant. Now, the assisted highlight mode is more competitive, can be closer, even below a 10% difference for many specs. In fact, Arms, Fury, Destro, Demo, Assassination, Shadow Priest, Ret Paladin, Frost Mage, Fire Mage, Marksmanship, BM, Devastation, Augmentation, Balanced Druid are all below a 10% gap if you're playing with the assisted highlight, so technically they could actually be playable even in more serious content, especially if you consider that not all players would be able to play an optimal rotation, right? These DPS differences are between someone playing its rotation optimally versus this assisted highlight. So if you, normal human, are not already able to play your rotation optimally, so your Fire Mage rotation optimally, so if you are like 15% behind the optimal rotation of Fire, but the assisted highlight allows you to be only 10% behind the optimal rotation of Fire, then technically, following the assisted highlight mode would give you more damage. The problem with the assisted highlight is that it is still tied to you looking at your bars, looking at your buttons and what is lighting up for you to press. Maybe players will come up with some unique ideas, like for example, okay, I guess it's time to no longer use bartender or add-ons that stop me from being able to see the glow, go into edit mode and start bringing these bars right in front of my characters, so I get to see them properly when they light up, and that's how I am going to properly work with this assisted highlight mode. But otherwise, that still remains a problem, that ultimately you kind of have to get your muscle memory yourself for being able to click these buttons, because otherwise having to spend time just to check out which of the icons is lighting up for you to press is not really that efficient in pretty much whichever kind of even slightly competitive content. You won't really have an extra thing to keep track of. If you already have, a lower performance in difficult content because you already have problems keeping track of everything, the incoming damage, the incoming mechanics, the stuff on the floor, the positioning of your character, and on top of that, you have to keep track of what is lighting up on your bars, that would probably just make it even worse. This is the current situation at the release of 11.1.7 with these two new features just added, the single button assistant and the assisted highlight, and in what and how they differ between the two. Yes, still, definitely, the assisted highlight is a better mode to use if you want to have better performance compared to this one, since this one is slowed down in its global cooldown by 250 milliseconds, so you're just going to be slower when playing this. But even the assisted highlight would come with its own problems of you having to spend more time, more attention in actually checking what even lights up on your bars in the first place. It is definitely a good way to learn specs you haven't played before. Like for example, on this character, I only play Balanced Druid, I don't have much of an idea on what to do with Feral, so it would be a decent idea whenever I want to move over to Feral to check out what the assisted highlight is telling me to press in the first place. that could also be a good way to use this new feature, to get used to a different spec you're not familiar with and with what you're supposed to be pressing in its rotation. However, for this though, on this Wednesday, at the beginning of 11.1.7, these two are the main crucial differences between the single button assistant and the assisted highlight, which just came out in this patch, last patch of Season 2, before we head now into Season 3. So, for today, on this Wednesday, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime,